212 guests confirmed, and not one of them came.
Yes, break it down.
Grace, do you want to wish someone a happy birthday?
Do we know her?
My daughter only wants to give her a birthday card. This ballroom is for guests of a certain caliber. It'll take 30 seconds.
Wait! Bring them back! That was not a request. This is the first true thing.
Victoria, the man they almost threw out last night was not just a delivery driver. Then who was he? Nathan Cole.
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
The Ambrose Grand Hotel sat on the corner of Michigan Avenue, like something carved out of old money, its brass doors polished until they threw back the whole street in gold. Inside, on the 11th floor, the Windsor Ballroom had been set for 212 guests. Round tables draped in ivory linen stretched from one end of the room to the other. A three-tier cake dusted in edible pearl and standing 4 feet tall waited untouched beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people's houses. Every chair had been angled at exactly the same degree. Every wine glass had been polished twice. It was 7:14 p.m. and not one guest had walked through the door. Victoria Hale sat near the head table in her wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the second hand of the wall clock make its slow, indifferent circle. She had built Hale Technologies from a garage in Evanston into a company worth $1.8 billion. She had been called fearless by 3 different business magazines. She had negotiated with men twice her age and never blinked. But tonight, at her 43rd birthday, she was learning something that fearlessness had never prepared her for. Success could fill a room with names. It could not make a single one of them show up. The accident had happened 14 months earlier, on a stretch of the Kennedy Expressway slick with November rain. A truck driver, exhausted from a double shift, drifted across 2 lanes at 11:52 p.m. Victoria woke up 9 days later in a hospital bed, with a doctor explaining gently that the damage to her T11 vertebra was permanent. She would keep her mind, she would keep her company. She would not keep her legs. What she had not expected to lose was everyone else. Business partners who once called her 3 times a day began routing her calls to voicemail. Friends who had toasted her at galas started sending texts with excuses instead of showing up. It was a slow erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only notice when you're sitting in a ballroom that cost $41,000 to rent and every single chair is empty. A tap came at the service door. Gregory Voss, the hotel's director of guest experience, appeared with a clipboard pressed to his chest like armor. He was 51 years old, precise in a way that bordered on cruelty, and he had built his entire career on the word standards. "Ms. Hale," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "should we begin breaking down the room?" Victoria looked at the cake, she looked at the empty chairs. Somewhere behind her ribs, something cracked quietly, the way ice cracks under weight nobody can see. "Yes," she said, "break it down." Nathan Cole did not know any of this when his delivery van pulled into the loading dock behind the Ambrose at 7:31 p.m. He wasn't there for a party. He was there because Riverside Logistics had a contract with the hotel's catering department, and his final stop of a 14-hour shift was 3 crates of imported olive oil that the evening chef needed for a private event upstairs. Nathan was 38, built like a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, wearing the same Navy Company hoodie he'd worn since 6 a.m. and jeans gone soft and pale at the knees from 100 washes. In the passenger seat, half asleep with a math worksheet still folded in her backpack, sat his 11-year-old daughter, Grace. His wife, Melissa, had died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, and since then, Nathan's schedule had become a careful, exhausting negotiation between delivery routes and school pickup times. On days when the after-school program closed early, Grace rode with him. She had learned to do her homework balanced on a clipboard, propped against the dashboard, the radio turned low. Nathan carried the first crate through the loading dock and paused near the kitchen doors, where 2 line cooks were quietly scraping untouched food into trash bins. "Rough night?" he asked. Nobody came when Elizabeth said, not looking up. 200 people confirmed, not one showed. Nathan set the crate down slower than he needed to. He thought about the year Melissa was sick, when the calendar had once been full of people who promised to help, and then, one by one stopped calling. 3. He knew what an empty room sounded like from the inside. 3. He walked to the service door and looked through the small round window into the ballroom. 3. A woman in a wheelchair sat alone beside a cake nobody would eat, staring at nothing in particular, her spine straight in the specific way people hold themselves when they have decided, quietly, not to cry in front of anyone. 3. Nathan went back outside, opened the van door, and looked at his daughter. 3. Grace, you want to go say happy birthday to somebody? 3. Grace looked up from her worksheet blinking. Do we know her? 3. No, Nathan said, that's kind of the point. 3. He asked the loading dock supervisor if it would be all right, and the supervisor, uncertain but not willing to stop him, shrugged and said he'd have to clear it with guest experience. 3. That was how Nathan and Grace ended up standing at the ballroom's side entrance at 7:38 p.m., Nathan still in his work hoodie, Grace holding a piece of birthday card she had folded and colored during lunch period that day, 3 stick figures around, a cake, a yellow sun in the corner, and 6 words in a child's careful print. Nobody deserves to feel forgotten. 3. Gregory Voss intercepted them before they'd taken 3 steps into the room. 3. Excuse me, he said, his voice dropping into the register he reserved for problems. 3. This is a private event. Deliveries go through the service corridor. 3. We're not delivering anything, Nathan said. We just wanted to wish her happy birthday. 3. Voss looked Nathan over the hoodie with the logistics company patch, the jeans, the scuffed boots, the way a man looks at a stain on a tablecloth. 3. This ballroom, he said, is for invited guests of a certain caliber. 3. I'm going to need you to head back to the loading dock. 3. Sir, it'll take 30 seconds. It's not about the 30 seconds, Voss said, and here his voice sharpened into something almost proud of itself. 3. It's about maintaining the standard of this event. We can't have hotel staff or delivery contractors mingling with the client's private gathering. 3. I hope you understand it isn't personal. It was, of course, entirely personal in the way these things always are. 3. Voss had spent 19 years at the Ambrose, learning that his authority lived entirely in these small enforced women who belonged in which room, who could be sent back through which door. 3. He had built an identity out of gatekeeping, and gatekeeping requires always someone on the other side of the gate. 3. Grace, still holding her card, looked between the 2 men, her small shoulders drawing inward the way children's do when adults start using the voice that means something is wrong. 3. She just wants to give her a card, Nathan said quietly. 3. That's all. I understand, Voss said in the exact tone of a man who did not, but rules exist for a reason. 3. If I let every well-meaning member of the public wander into private events, we'd have no standards left at all. 3. He motioned toward the service corridor. I'll have security escort you back if that's easier. 3. The words security landed on Nathan like a slap he hadn't braced for. 3. He had spent 3 years absorbing small humiliations, quietly landlords who spoke slower to him once they drove a delivery van, insurance adjusters who assumed he couldn't afford his own daughter's asthma medication, and he had learned, mostly, to let them slide off. 3. But Grace was watching. Grace, who had already lost one parent's dignity to a hospital system that treated grief like paperwork, was standing here watching a stranger threaten to have her father removed from a room for the crime of being kind. 3. We'll go, Nathan said, taking Grace's hand. You don't need security. 3. They turned to leave, and that was the first moment the whole evening would later hinge on Grace's small hand, tightening in her father's, the paper card bending slightly at the corner where her thumb pressed too hard, the chandelier light catching the yellow crayon sun for just a second before they stepped back into the service corridor. 3. Nobody in that ballroom at 7:41 p.m. on a Tuesday in October had any idea what that 30 seconds would eventually cost the man standing at the door with the clipboard. 3. Victoria had seen it. From across the room, through the gap in the drapery, she'd watched a father and daughter get turned away for trying to wish her a happy birthday. 3. She wheeled herself forward, faster than her physical therapist would have liked. 3. Wait, she called out. Gregory, who was that? Just a delivery contractor, miss. 3. Hale, nothing you need to concern yourself with. I've handled it. 3. Bring them back. Voss hesitated, recalibrating, the way men like him do when the ground shifts unexpectedly beneath a rule they'd assumed was permanent. 3. Ma'am, I really don't think. Victoria's voice had the same flatness it carried in board meetings, the tone that had once made a hostile acquirer withdraw a 9-figure offer within an hour. 3. Bring them back. He went reluctantly and found Nathan and Grace already back in the loading dock. Nathan lifting the second olive oil crate onto a hand truck like nothing had happened. Ms. Hale would like you to come back inside, Voss said, each word extracted from him like a splinter. Nathan looked at Grace. Grace looked at her card, now slightly bent. Okay, Nathan said, but only if it's really all right. It was more than all right. Victoria met them at the ballroom's edge, and when Grace held out the handmade card with both hands, Victoria took it like it was made of something more valuable than the chandelier above them. She read the 6 words twice. Nobody deserves to feel forgotten. Something in her face, held rigid for 14 months, came loose. Thank you, Victoria said, and her voice cracked on the second word. This is the first true thing anyone has told me all year. What happened over the next 90 minutes became, in the retelling, the story the hotel staff would talk about for years. The 2 line cooks who'd been scraping food into trash bins came back out with fresh plates. A pianist who had already packed his sheet music returned to the baby grand and began playing, softly, unprompted. Housekeepers still in uniform drifted in one at a time, then in twos until nearly 30 Ambrose employees who had finished their shift stayed anyway, standing along the ballroom's edges, clapping when the birthday song came around. Because for the first time all evening, the room finally had people who wanted to be in it. Nathan sat beside Victoria's wheelchair for most of that hour, still in his work hoodie, telling her because she asked, and because grief recognizes grief the way a key recognizes its lock about Melissa, about the year of chemotherapy and the friends who evaporated, about learning to braid Grace's hair from a video at 6:40 in the morning because there was nobody left to teach him. Victoria listened the way she hadn't let herself listen to anything in 14 months, without calculating an angle, without managing an image. Gregory Voss watched all of it from the doorway with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Already, composing the version of the evening he would tell his supervisor a version where he had simply been protecting the event's integrity, where the delivery driver had been the disruption, and he, Voss, had been the one holding the line. He would not get the chance to tell that version for long. At 9:52 the following morning, Victoria's assistant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Nair, was compiling the guest incident report the Rose's general manager had insisted on filing, when a name jumped out at her from the loading dock sign-in sheet. N. Cole, Riverside Logistics. She recognized it not from the party, but from an 11-month-old wire transfer memo she'd filed away and mostly forgotten, a memo tied to a private holding entity called Colebridge Partners, LLC, which had quietly purchased 41% of Hale Technologies' distressed private shares 9 months after Victoria's accident, back when 2 nervous board members had tried to force a fire sale acquisition while she was still in physical therapy. The purchase had gone through a blind trust. Victoria herself had never been told the buyer's name, only that someone unnamed had stepped in and blocked the takeover, buying just enough shares to make the hostile bid mathematically impossible. Priya called the trust's law firm at 10:14 a.m. What she got back 40 minutes later made her walk down the hallway to Victoria's office instead of sending it in an email. Victoria, she said, closing the door, I need you to sit down. You already are. I need you to hold on to something. Priya, you're scaring me, the man from last night. Nathan Cole. Priya set a printed document on the desk, the trust's confirmation letter, dated that morning, releasing Nathan's name now that the blind trust's confidentiality term had lapsed. He's not a delivery contractor who happened to wander into your birthday party. He's the reason you still own your company. Victoria stared at the letter for a long moment, then reached for her phone and called the number listed for the trust's counsel. The attorney, a measured man named Foster Griggs, confirmed it within the first 90 seconds. Mr. Cole structured the purchase anonymously, specifically so it wouldn't affect how people treated you or him, Griggs said. He didn't want gratitude, he wanted you to keep your company on its own terms. He's been on your board's shareholder registry as an unnamed trust entity for 11 months. As of this morning, per the trust's own sunset clause, that's no longer required. At 2:30 that afternoon, the Hale Technologies board convened an emergency session, not because anything was wrong, but because 6 board members wanted, urgently, to understand how the man who had saved the company from a hostile takeover had spent the previous evening being nearly thrown out of its CEO's birthday party by a hotel employee. Board Chairman Walter Ebsen put it more bluntly on the call. I would like someone to explain to me how the largest shareholder in this company got told to use the service corridor. That question did not stay contained to a boardroom for long. By Thursday, 3 former Ambrose employees had come forward not because anyone asked them to, but because word of what had almost happened at Victoria's party had moved through the hotel staff group chat overnight, and each of them recognized the shape of it immediately. Denise Okafor, a former front supervisor who'd left the Ambrose 8 months earlier, described being reprimanded by Voss for allowing a wheelchair user's home health aide into a wedding reception without verifying invitation status. First, a policy that existed nowhere in the hotel's actual guest handbook. Marcus Whitfield, a former valet, recalled Voss instructing him, more than once, to discreetly reroute guests whose clothing didn't match the event's expected tier, regardless of whether they held valid invitations. And Aisha Renwick, who had waited tables at the Ambrose for 6 years before quitting, described an incident where Voss had refused entry to a bride's own grandmother because her wheelchair, in his words, disrupted the room's sightlines. None of it had ever been formally reported. All of it had been absorbed quietly by people who needed the job more than they needed the fight. What made Nathan Cole's case different wasn't that the harm was worse. It was that for the first time, the person on the receiving end turned out to be someone the hotel's parent ownership group could not afford to ignore. Called into a meeting with the Ambrose's general manager and its regional HR director on Friday at 11:03 a.m., did not apologize. He explained at length that he had been enforcing established protocol. That event required careful curation, that he had, if anything, been doing his job with unusual diligence. When the HR director read him the 3 prior employee statements, he called them exaggerations from disgruntled former staff. When she read him a 4th statement, this one from the loading dock supervisor who'd witnessed Tuesday night, directly, Voss simply repeated, calmer this time, that standards exist for a reason, and that he stood by every decision he had made. He was terminated that afternoon, effective immediately, cause violation of the hotel's non-discrimination and guest dignity policy, pattern of conduct. The termination letter cited 4 separate incidents spanning 2 years. Voss, walking out through the same loading dock where he had once turned Nathan and Grace away, told the general manager he would let the lawyers sort out who was really in the wrong here. Nobody stopped him from saying it. Nobody needed to. The consequences did not end with one firing. Cole Bridge Partners, it turned out, was also the anchor tenant leaseholder for the Ambrose's 14th floor conference suites, a 7-year, $22 million contract Nathan had quietly arranged through a separate entity 2 years earlier, long before anyone at the hotel connected his name to anything. On the following Monday, Nathan's lawyer sent formal notice that Cole Bridge would not be renewing the lease when it expired in 4 months, citing plainly concerns about the hotel's guest treatment standards. The Ambrose's ownership group, facing the loss of its single largest recurring account, launched an internal review that eventually implicated 2 additional managers for similar patterns of quiet, unreported discrimination against guests who didn't fit an assumed profile: people in wheelchairs, people in work uniforms, people whose faces or clothes didn't match somebody's private idea of who deserved a room. Nathan never asked for any of this. When Victoria called him, 3 days after the party, to explain what she'd learned and to thank him properly for the first time, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. I didn't do it so you'd owe me anything, he said. I did it because Grace was watching, and I wanted her to grow up believing kindness doesn't need a reason. Victoria offered him a formal board seat. He declined it gently, saying he had no interest in corporate meetings. What he accepted instead, 6 weeks later, was something smaller, and to him considerably more important: the role of community outreach director for a new foundation Victoria had just chartered, called the Open Chair Fund, built to support single parents, caregivers, and people rebuilding their lives after catastrophic injury. Its founding grant was $4,112,000, seeded entirely from Victoria's personal holdings. Its first office, repainted the color of a school bus, sat 2 floors below Hale Technologies' headquarters. close enough that Grace could visit after school and do her homework at a real desk instead of a delivery van's dashboard. 3. 8 months later, on a Thursday afternoon at 4:07 p.m., the Ambroses' new general manager, hired specifically to overhaul what internal memos, now called the Voss-era culture, signed a company-wide dignity policy requiring every staff member to complete get-stage training twice a year, with a direct, anonymous reporting line to corporate HR rather than to department directors. 3. Denise Okafor was hired back as the hotel's new director of guest experience, the same title Voss had once held, though she ran it, staff said, like a job meant to open doors instead of guard them. 3. Victoria's next birthday, the following October, filled the Windsor ballroom again, but this time, the 208 guests were not celebrities or investors. 3. They were foundation grant recipients. They were former Ambrose employees who'd once been afraid to speak up. 3. They were Nathan and Grace, seated near the front. Grace, now 12, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, the same paper birthday card from the year before framed and hanging in Victoria's office, still creased at the corner where a small thumb had pressed too hard against it once, in a service corridor, on a night nobody thought anyone was watching. 3. Victoria stood with braces with effort, with Nathan's hand steady at her elbow long enough to say the only toast she gave that night. 3. A year ago, this room was empty, because I thought people only showed up for what I could give them, she said. 3. I was wrong, they show up for who you are when nobody's counting. 3. Remember the empty chairs, then remember who filled them. 3. Somewhere in the back of the room, a pianist who had once packed away his sheet music too early began, unprompted, to play. 3. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. 3. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. 3. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. 3. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. 3. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.